A decade ago, a chance encounter brought together two people from vastly different worlds, a meeting that would change the course of their lives forever. He was a millionaire, a man who had built an empire from scratch. With sharp business acumen and relentless ambition, he had grown his fortune to unimaginable heights. He was the epitome of success, a man used to getting what he wanted, living a life of luxury that most could only dream of. His name was whispered in the halls of power, his decisions affecting entire industries. Yet for all his wealth, there was a certain emptiness to his existence, a void he couldn't quite place or fill. She, on the other hand, was a young woman born and raised in a small rural village in Africa. Her life was simple and far removed from the fast-paced world of corporate giants and lavish parties. She was beautiful in her own unique way, with eyes that spoke of wisdom and a spirit forged in resilience. The realities of her world were harsh: poverty, limited opportunities, and the weight of expectations placed on her by family and community. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity, embracing the challenges with an unshakable resolve. The two were never meant to cross paths, but as fate would have it, they did. It happened during one of the millionaire's business trips, an extravagant vacation meant to mix pleasure with potential investment opportunities. He had flown in on his private jet, landing in a city known for its vibrant culture but also for its economic disparity. He was accustomed to seeing poverty in his travels, but never had it touched him personally. This trip, however, was different. One evening, after a long day of meetings and negotiations, he found himself wandering through the city, drawn to the local nightlife. The bright lights of the city streets were a stark contrast to the surrounding neighborhoods where most of the locals lived. He entered a modest yet lively bar in search of something other than the usual luxury he surrounded himself with. The air was thick with the sounds of drums, laughter, and the smell of street food being cooked nearby. He was out of place here in his tailored suit, but somehow he didn't mind. And then he saw her. She was working as a waitress that night, moving swiftly between tables, balancing trays with effortless grace. Her dark hair was tied back, and her dress, though simple, couldn't hide her natural beauty. The millionaire found his gaze lingering on her longer than he intended. There was something different about her, an air of authenticity, a rawness that was captivating. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that alone made her stand out in his world where appearances were everything. As the night wore on, their eyes met more than once, and something unspoken passed between them. When the crowd began to thin, he took the opportunity to strike up a conversation. He wasn't used to women not falling over themselves to catch his attention, but she wasn't like the others. There was no pretense, no immediate interest in his wealth or status. She seemed real. He asked her about her life, her dreams, and for a moment she let her guard down, sharing stories of her family, her struggles, and her hope for a better future. She spoke of the dreams she once had: to go to school, to travel, to see the world beyond the confines of her village. But dreams, she said with a bittersweet smile, were often luxuries people like her couldn't afford. Their conversation flowed easily, and as the night deepened, something unexpected happened. They connected. Despite their differences in status, upbringing, and even language, they found common ground. He was mesmerized by her honesty and the strength that lay beneath her soft exterior. She, in turn, was intrigued by his confidence, his worldly experience, and the way he listened when she spoke. The hours slipped away, and before either of them realized it, they were alone in the dimly lit bar. The city had quieted down, leaving them in their own little world. One thing led to another, and what started as a casual conversation turned into something deeper. They spent the rest of the night together, wrapped in the fleeting intensity of a romance neither of them had expected. But like all fleeting things, their time together had an expiration date. The following morning, the weight of reality began to sink in. He was a man with a life far removed from hers, a life filled with responsibilities, commitments, and the constant pursuit of more. She, on the other hand, was bound to her world, tethered by family ties, societal expectations, and the need to survive. Neither spoke of the future, perhaps because deep down they both knew that there wasn't one. As he prepared to leave the next day, there were no promises made, no talks of what if. They parted ways with little more than a lingering glance, each of them unsure if they would ever see each other again. He left without a word of goodbye, hopping into a car that whisked him away to his next destination. For him, it was another brief affair, a distraction from his otherwise meticulously planned life. But for her, it was something more, a bittersweet memory that she would carry with her long after he had forgotten. He had no idea that their one night together would have consequences far beyond what either of them could have imagined. As the days passed, the memory of the girl from the small African village began to fade from the millionaire's mind. His life returned to its usual rhythm: meetings, deals, extravagant parties, and the never-ending pursuit of success. She became little more than a passing thought, a chapter closed before it had truly begun. But her life was about to change in ways neither of them could have foreseen. What he didn't know was that the brief time they had spent together had left a lasting impact, a seed of life growing inside her. She discovered she was pregnant shortly after he left. Her world turned upside down. She tried to reach out, but by then he had vanished into the haze of his high-powered life, unreachable and uninterested in looking back. And so she was left alone to face the consequences of their fleeting romance, unsure of what the future would hold for her and the child she now carried. When the realization of her pregnancy finally set in, the young woman felt a wave of emotions she had never known before: shock, fear, confusion. She sat alone in her small, dimly lit room, her hand instinctively resting on her still flat belly. The air around her felt heavy, and her heart pounded in her chest as the enormity of the situation began to dawn on her. How could this have happened? Just a few weeks ago, she had been going about her life as usual, working long hours at the local bar and helping her family with whatever little money she could earn. Life wasn't easy, but it was predictable. She had never imagined that a single night with a man who seemed so far removed from her world would change everything so drastically. She tried to remember the last time she had heard from him, but the truth was, he had disappeared just as quickly as he had entered her life. There were no phone calls, no letters, no messages. The memory of him, while vivid, was beginning to feel like a distant dream. She didn't even know where he was, let alone how to contact him. She had no way of telling him what had happened, that their brief connection had resulted in a life-altering consequence. As the weeks passed, the signs of pregnancy became undeniable. She was nauseous in the mornings, fatigued by midday, and her appetite began to change in ways that were both surprising and inconvenient. Each day brought a new reminder that she was carrying his child, a child that she would now have to raise on her own. The weight of that reality settled heavily on her shoulders. She had grown up in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's business. Word traveled fast, and news of her pregnancy spread even faster. At first, there were whispers, quiet judgments passed among neighbors, the older women shaking their heads disapprovingly. Some were sympathetic, while others saw her as nothing more than a cautionary tale for young girls who dared to dream too big. But the harshest judgment came from her own family. Her parents, traditional and deeply rooted in their values, were devastated when they learned of her pregnancy. They were disappointed, not only because she was unmarried, but because the father of the child was someone they would never know, someone who had abandoned her without a second thought. Her mother cried for days, heartbroken by the news, and her father, though he said little, could barely look her in the eye. Their disapproval was palpable, and the young woman felt the sting of their shame deep in her heart. They had hoped for more for her, a stable marriage, a family life that mirrored the traditions of their ancestors. But now, in their eyes, she had failed them. Despite the hurt, she knew she had to carry on. The reality of her situation demanded strength she wasn't sure she possessed, but she would have to find it somewhere. She made the decision to keep the child, even though she knew the road ahead would be incredibly difficult. She couldn't bear the thought of giving up her baby, no matter how challenging her circumstances were. As the months went by, her belly grew, and with it, the challenges she faced seemed to multiply. She had to leave her job at the bar when her pregnancy became too noticeable, and finding another source of income proved to be nearly impossible. There weren't many opportunities for women like her, young, unmarried, and now visibly pregnant. Employers were reluctant to hire her, fearing she would soon be unable to work at all. With no money coming in, she had to rely on the kindness of friends and neighbors to get by. Some helped her without question, offering food or small amounts of money when they could. Others, however, were less understanding. The judgment in their eyes was clear, even if they didn't say it out loud. To them, she was a young woman who had made a mistake, and now she was paying the price. The strain on her relationship with her parents only grew as her due date approached. They loved her, but they struggled to accept her new reality. They were already burdened by their own financial struggles, and now there would be another mouth to feed. Her father in particular remained distant, unable to reconcile his disappointment with the love he still felt for his daughter. Her mother, though heartbroken, helped in the only way she knew how, by quietly preparing for the baby's arrival, sewing blankets and gathering whatever small items they could afford. But even amidst the hardships, there were moments of hope. As the baby began to move inside her, she would sit alone at night, feeling the tiny kicks and flutters, and in those moments, she felt an overwhelming sense of connection to the life growing within her. It was a strange mixture of fear and love, the uncertainty of the future tempered by the undeniable bond she felt with her child. When the time finally came, she gave birth to a baby boy. He was small but strong, with bright, curious eyes that seemed to take in the world around him, even in his first moments of life. Holding him for the first time, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her, relief, exhaustion, and a fierce protectiveness she had never known before. Her son became the center of her world. Despite the hardships, the sleepless nights, and the constant worry about how they would get by, she loved him with every fiber of her being. He gave her a purpose, a reason to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. But raising him alone was far from easy. As a single mother, she faced challenges that often felt insurmountable. She had no stable income, no real support system, and the stigma of being an unwed mother followed her wherever she went. She returned to work when she could, taking on small jobs here and there, but the money she earned was barely enough to cover their most basic needs. Her son grew quickly, and with each passing year, his resemblance to the man who had left them behind became more and more apparent. The boy had the same sharp features, the same piercing eyes, and as he got older, people began to notice. They would make comments in passing, observations that were innocent enough, but each one was a reminder of the man she had once known and the life she could never go back to. As her son reached his toddler years, the struggles only intensified. He was bright and curious, always asking questions she sometimes didn't have the answers to. She did her best to shield him from the harsh realities of their life, but it wasn't always possible. He would see her crying sometimes, exhausted from a long day of work, and though he was too young to understand, he would reach out to comfort her in the only way he knew how, with a hug or a quiet, "It's okay, Mama." Despite everything, she refused to give up. She would fight for her son's future, no matter the odds. She enrolled him in the best school she could afford, though it wasn't much, and made sure he knew the value of hard work and resilience. She wanted him to have a better life than the one she had, a life that was not defined by the mistakes of the past, but by the possibilities of the future. Every day was a struggle, but every day was also a reminder of how far she had come. The whispers in the village still followed her, but she no longer cared. She had faced the harsh judgment of others, the disappointment of her family, and the uncertainty of raising a child alone, and she had survived. More than that, she had thrived in her own quiet way. But even as the years passed and her son grew older, there was one question that lingered in her mind, one question she had never been able to shake. Would he ever know his father? Would the man who had walked out of their lives so long ago ever return to see what he had left behind? She didn't know the answer. All she knew was that no matter what, she and her son would be okay. They had to be, because despite the pain and the struggles, they had each other, and that she knew was enough. While the young woman and her son were enduring a life of struggle and sacrifice, the millionaire continued his journey through life, wrapped in luxury and success. Far removed from the village he had left behind, his world was one of power, influence, and untold wealth. The life he had carefully built for himself was a fortress of privilege, where nothing seemed out of reach and everything was possible, for the right price. In the years that followed his brief encounter with the young woman, his empire only grew larger. He was the kind of man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and in high society circles. He traveled the world effortlessly, hopping from one country to another in his private jet, attending exclusive parties, closing deals with governments and corporations alike. His name was synonymous with wealth and power, and his influence stretched across continents. He barely remembered the young woman he had met all those years ago. To him, that night had been like so many others, an impulsive fling, a moment of passion that dissolved into nothing as quickly as it had begun. His life moved too fast for him to dwell on the past, and in the whirlwind of business ventures, charity galas, and lavish vacations, the memory of that brief romance in a distant part of Africa faded into the background. He had women come and go in his life, some of whom were drawn to his power, others to his wealth. None stayed for long. Commitment wasn't something he craved. He had too much on his plate to be tied down by the responsibilities of love or family. As his fortune grew, so did his appetite for the finer things in life. His estate, a sprawling mansion perched on a hill with a view that stretched for miles, was the embodiment of luxury. It was filled with art from the world's greatest masters, imported furniture, and custom-built amenities that catered to every conceivable whim. He threw extravagant parties attended by celebrities, politicians, and other elite figures. These gatherings were not only a way to entertain but also to build connections that could further expand his business empire. The world was at his feet, and he relished in the control he had over it. His wealth afforded him a lifestyle few could imagine. He spent his weekends on yachts cruising through crystal-clear waters, his evenings dining in Michelin-starred restaurants, and his nights in penthouse suites overlooking the world's most iconic skylines. There were no limits for a man like him, no boundaries to what he could achieve, no obstacles he couldn't overcome. He was insulated from the world's harshest realities, far removed from the struggles of ordinary people. He was a man who prided himself on his independence, his ability to navigate life on his own terms. Family, to him, was little more than an afterthought. His parents had passed away years ago, and though he had siblings, they rarely saw one another. He had long since become the outlier in his family, the one who had risen far beyond what anyone had expected. In truth, he didn't need them. His business was his life and his wealth his companion. But even as he built this life of opulence, there were moments when he felt a strange, nagging emptiness. It was fleeting, often drowned out by the thrill of success or the distractions of his lifestyle, but it was there. In quiet moments, alone in his office late at night, or during the rare times when he found himself without a pressing engagement, he sometimes felt the pull of something missing. He dismissed it as nothing more than the occasional bout of loneliness, easily remedied by the next big deal or the company of another beautiful woman. His businesses continued to expand, branching into new industries, new markets. He became known not only for his wealth but for his ruthless approach to business. Competitors feared him and partners respected him, but he had few real friends. He had no need for them. In his world, relationships were transactional, built on what people could offer, not on genuine connection or trust. He had no patience for weakness or sentimentality, traits he saw as impediments to success. The years rolled by and he scarcely noticed the passage of time. He lived in the present, consumed by the pursuit of more money, more power, more influence. Each year brought new accomplishments, new milestones. His name appeared regularly in financial magazines, hailed as one of the most influential and successful businessmen of his generation. He reveled in the accolades, the recognition. But even as he did, the emptiness he had felt on occasion seemed to grow, if only in the smallest of ways. He filled his life with distractions. He collected rare cars, each one more luxurious than the last, and spent his free time driving them on private tracks. He bought properties in exotic locations, each one more stunning than the last, and spent his holidays in isolation, far from the demands of his work. He surrounded himself with the finest things money could buy: jewelry, designer clothes, custom-made watches, but none of it seemed to fully satisfy him. The idea of settling down, of having a family, was something he avoided at all costs. He told himself he didn't need it, that it would only slow him down, tether him to responsibilities he had no interest in. He had seen what family life did to his colleagues, the endless compromises, the sacrifices. He saw them juggle work and home, and he couldn't fathom why anyone would willingly choose that life. He had built something extraordinary, something that would last long after he was gone, and he wasn't about to let anything or anyone interfere with that. Children were especially foreign to him. He couldn't picture himself as a father, couldn't imagine the idea of nurturing or caring for a child. The thought of it made him uncomfortable, not because he disliked children, but because it seemed so far removed from who he was. His world was one of control, efficiency, and precision. Children, in his mind, represented chaos, unpredictability, and vulnerability. He didn't have time for any of that. And so the years passed and he continued to live his life, blissfully unaware of the child he had left behind. The young woman he had spent that brief night with had long since faded from his memory. He had no idea that across the world a boy was growing up who bore his name and features, a boy who would one day unknowingly cross paths with him. In the meantime, his empire continued to flourish, his wealth grew to unimaginable heights, his influence expanding into realms he had once thought unattainable. He invested in technology startups, built real estate empires, and became a major player in global finance. The more he acquired, the more he wanted, and there was no end in sight. His life from the outside was a masterpiece of success, a portrait of a man who had everything. Yet despite all his success, there were moments when he would find himself alone, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, watching the city lights twinkle below. In those moments, a strange feeling would wash over him, a vague sense of unease, as though something important had slipped through his fingers. It was a fleeting sensation, gone as quickly as it arrived, but each time it happened, it seemed to linger a little longer. He dismissed it as nothing more than the cost of his lifestyle. After all, what man with his level of wealth and power could ever expect to feel truly content? He had achieved everything he had set out to achieve. He had built an empire, amassed a fortune, and carved out a legacy. If there was still something missing, something that gnawed at him in the quiet moments, then surely it was a price worth paying. But little did he know the choices he had made years ago, the night he had spent with a girl in a far-off village, were about to catch up with him. A reckoning was coming, one that would force him to confront the consequences of his actions in ways he never could have imagined. And when that day came, the life he had built, the fortress of success and wealth he had surrounded himself with, would be shaken to its core. The years had passed in a blur for the young woman and her son. Life was difficult, a daily struggle to make ends meet, but they had survived. Her son was now 10 years old, a bright, inquisitive boy who had inherited much of his father's physical traits. His striking features, the sharpness in his eyes, and the way he carried himself often reminded her of the man who had disappeared from their lives so long ago. Yet despite the shadow of the past, her son was a light in her world, a source of strength and hope that carried her through the hardest days. Her son, named Kwame, was an extraordinary child. He was sharp beyond his years, asking questions that often left his mother marveling at how quickly he had grown. He was curious about everything, nature, science, history, but more than anything he was curious about his father. For years he had asked simple questions that she had avoided answering directly. "Where is my father?" Or, "What is he like?" At first she had brushed these questions aside with vague responses, telling him that his father had been a man from far away who couldn't stay. But now that he was older, Kwame was no longer satisfied with half-truths. He wanted to know more. He wanted details. He had noticed how different he looked from the other boys in the village, the way his skin was a few shades lighter, the sharpness of his jawline and his eyes, which seemed to hold a certain intensity. He had always known that there was something different about him, something that set him apart from his friends. The whispers he heard from the other villagers didn't help. They spoke of his mother in hushed tones when they thought he wasn't listening, their words filled with judgment and curiosity. One evening, Kwame approached his mother again, more determined than ever to get answers. They were sitting outside their modest home, watching the sun set over the horizon. The air was warm, and the village was quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant chatter of neighbors and the occasional bark of a dog. It was a moment of peace, the kind of evening that made it easy to forget the hardships they faced. "Mama," Kwame began, his voice serious, "you've never told me the truth about my father. I need to know. Who is he? Where is he?" His mother looked at him, her heart heavy. She had always dreaded this moment, knowing that one day she would have to tell him the truth. But she had never been ready, and even now she felt the familiar sting of guilt and uncertainty rise within her. She loved her son more than anything, but she had never been able to shake the shame and pain of her past, or the fear that the truth would only hurt him. She sighed deeply, her gaze fixed on the horizon as she tried to find the right words. "Kwame," she said softly, "your father was a man from a faraway place, a man who came into my life for a very short time." "Where did he go?" Kwame asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Why didn't he stay with us?" Her heart ached at the innocence in his voice, the unknowing hurt behind his question. She had spent years trying to protect him from the truth, but now it was clear that he needed to know. "He left, Kwame," she said quietly. "He had a life somewhere else, a life that didn't include us. He didn't know I was pregnant with you when he left. I tried to reach him, but—" Her voice trailed off as she struggled to hold back the tears. He never came back. Kwame was silent for a moment, processing what his mother had just told him. The hurt in his eyes was evident, but so was the determination. "Do you know where he is now?" She shook her head. "No, I don't. He's a powerful man, very wealthy and very far away from here. He's not someone we can easily reach." Kwame frowned, his young mind already turning over the possibilities. "But we could try, couldn't we? There has to be a way to find him." His mother hesitated. She had always known that one day Kwame might want to seek out his father, but she had never prepared herself for what that would mean. The idea of facing the man who had abandoned her, who had left her to raise their child alone, filled her with a mixture of anger and fear. She didn't know what she would say if they ever met again, or worse, what his reaction would be to seeing the son he never knew he had. Still, looking into Kwame's determined face, she knew that the time had come to face the past, not for her sake, but for her son's. He had a right to know where he came from, even if it meant reopening old wounds. "I don't know how to find him," she said honestly, "but if you really want to look for him, we can try." Kwame's face lit up with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. For years, he had imagined what it would be like to meet his father, to see the man who had given him his features, his intelligence, and perhaps even his drive. He didn't know what he expected, but the idea of finally knowing the truth filled him with hope. Over the next few weeks they began their search. It wasn't easy. Finding a man who lived in a world so far removed from their own seemed impossible. But Kwame was relentless, spending hours asking questions and looking through the limited resources they had. They had no internet, no modern tools of communication, but they made use of what they did have: rumors, connections, and the sparse information his mother had managed to piece together over the years. Eventually they found a lead, a name that matched the man his mother had described. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a starting point. The man was a wealthy businessman, a millionaire with interests in multiple industries. He lived far away, in a city that seemed like a different world entirely. But the more Kwame learned, the more convinced he became that this man was his father. The next step was harder. They had no way of reaching him directly, no contacts that could put them in touch. It felt like an impossible task, but Kwame's determination never wavered. His mother, though more cautious, supported him as best she could. She knew how much this meant to him, even if it terrified her. Then one day they got a break. A friend of a friend had connections in the city where the millionaire lived. It was a tenuous link, but it was the best chance they had. The woman they knew worked as a housekeeper for one of the millionaire's associates, and through her they managed to send a letter. It was a simple letter written by Kwame in his own hand, explaining who he was and asking to meet the man he believed to be his father. They didn't know if the letter would ever reach him or if he would even read it, but it was all they could do. Weeks passed and there was no response. Kwame tried to hide his disappointment, but his mother could see it in his eyes. She tried to comfort him, telling him that maybe the letter had gotten lost, or that the man might be too busy to respond. But deep down she feared that the truth was much harsher, that the man who had left them behind once had no interest in ever looking back. Then one evening, when they had almost given up hope, a letter arrived. It was a formal letter, written on expensive paper and addressed to Kwame. With trembling hands he opened it and read the words that would change his life forever. The letter was from the millionaire's office. It was short and to the point. He had received Kwame's message, and though he didn't recall ever meeting his mother, he was willing to meet the boy. The tone of the letter was businesslike, detached, but it didn't matter. For Kwame, it was the beginning of a dream he had held on to for as long as he could remember. His mother, on the other hand, felt a mixture of emotions: relief, fear, and a deep sense of foreboding. She knew that this meeting would change everything, for better or for worse. But there was no turning back now. Kwame was determined to meet his father, and she would stand by him no matter what the outcome might be. The date for the meeting was set, and as the day approached, both mother and son felt the weight of the moment looming over them. Kwame was excited, hopeful that he would finally get the answers he had been searching for. His mother, though proud of his determination, was filled with anxiety. She had no idea how the man would react, whether he would accept his son or reject him as an unwanted consequence of a forgotten past. And so the day came. They traveled to the city, a journey that felt surreal to both of them. For Kwame, it was like stepping into another world. Tall buildings, expensive cars, and people dressed in clothes that looked like they belonged in magazines. For his mother, it was a reminder of the life she had left behind, the world she had briefly touched but could never fully be a part of. They arrived at the office building where the meeting was to take place, their nerves on edge as they were led through the sleek modern hallways by an assistant. Kwame's heart raced with every step, a mixture of excitement and fear coursing through him. His mother walked beside him, her own emotions a storm of uncertainty. When they finally entered the room, there he was, the man who had changed their lives so long ago without even realizing it. As Kwame and his mother entered the opulent office, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The room itself was a reflection of the man who stood at its center, tastefully decorated with sleek, modern furniture, walls adorned with expensive artwork, and a panoramic view of the city that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sheer scale of the wealth and power on display was overwhelming for Kwame, who had spent his life in a small, modest village where luxury meant a full meal and a roof that didn't leak. There, standing tall in a tailored suit, was the man they had come to meet, the millionaire who unknowingly had fathered a son and left without a trace. He appeared every bit as imposing and unapproachable as Kwame's mother had described him. His presence filled the room, his expression unreadable, and his cold, calculating eyes scanned them with curiosity, perhaps even suspicion. For Kwame, this was a moment he had dreamed of for years, meeting the man who had given him life, the man whose absence had left a hole in his heart that he had never been able to fill. But now, standing in front of him, the boy wasn't sure what to feel. He had imagined this meeting 1,000 different ways in his head, but the reality was far more intimidating than he had anticipated. He could feel his palms sweating, his heart pounding, and his throat tightening as he struggled to find his voice. His mother stood beside him, tense but composed. She had prepared herself for this confrontation, though it wasn't an easy thing to face the man who had abandoned her so easily all those years ago. There was a heaviness in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of the complicated history that had brought them to this moment. The millionaire, for his part, appeared slightly taken aback by the sight of the boy who stood before him, a boy who looked so much like him that it was almost eerie. He had read the letter, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of meeting a child he hadn't known existed. He scanned Kwame's features, the shape of his face, the intensity in his eyes, the resemblance that was undeniable. This boy was his son, but the shock of it, the weight of the situation didn't fully register on his face. Instead, he maintained the same distant, controlled expression he wore in business meetings. To him, this was just another negotiation, another puzzle to solve. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the millionaire finally spoke, his voice calm but detached. "So you must be Kwame." Kwame nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a reassuring look before turning her attention to the man who had once promised her the world, only to disappear without a trace. The man's gaze shifted to her, and for a brief moment something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps a faint recognition of the woman he had left behind all those years ago, but whatever emotions might have surfaced were quickly buried beneath the same mask of composure. "I received your letter," he said, his tone neutral, as though this were a routine meeting. "You say you're my son." It wasn't a question, but a statement, and one that carried with it the unspoken implication that he wasn't entirely convinced. Kwame felt a knot form in his stomach. He had imagined a warmer welcome, some acknowledgement of the connection they shared, but instead it felt like he was being assessed, judged. His mother, sensing the tension, spoke up. "He is your son," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of the years she had spent raising him alone. "I tried to contact you when I found out I was pregnant, but you were already gone. I had no way of reaching you." The millionaire's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something, a moment of realization, perhaps even guilt. He had moved on so quickly after that brief fling in the village, never once considering that there might be consequences. He hadn't looked back, hadn't thought about the young woman he had spent that night with, let alone the possibility that she might have been carrying his child. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on Kwame as though trying to process the reality of the situation. Finally, he let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't know," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. "If I had known, things might have been different." It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more of an acknowledgement, an admission that he hadn't been aware of his role in their lives. But to Kwame, those words felt hollow, as though the man was trying to distance himself from any sense of responsibility. Kwame, who had been silent up until this point, finally found his voice. "Why didn't you come back?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with the weight of a decade's worth of unanswered questions. "Why did you leave?" The millionaire shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unprepared for such a direct question. He glanced at Kwame's mother, then back at the boy. "I wasn't looking for anything long-term," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I had no idea that night would lead to this. My life is complicated." Kwame's heart sank. He had hoped for something more, some sign that his father had regretted leaving, that he had thought about them over the years. But instead, it felt like his father was treating this as an inconvenience, a disruption to the carefully crafted life he had built for himself. His mother, sensing her son's disappointment, stepped forward. "Kwame deserves better than that," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "He's your son, whether you intended for him to be or not. He's grown up without you, and now he's here. What are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. For the first time, the millionaire's mask of indifference seemed to crack. He looked at Kwame, really looked at him, and for a brief moment, something like regret flickered across his face. But then just as quickly it was gone. "I don't know what you expect from me," he said quietly. "I didn't plan for this. My life, it's not set up for something like this." Kwame's chest tightened. He had imagined so many different outcomes for this meeting, but he had never anticipated that his father would be so distant, so unwilling to engage with the reality of his existence. The man who stood before him was not the father he had hoped for. "I don't want anything from you," Kwame said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted to know who you are. I wanted to know why you left." The millionaire looked down, his expression unreadable. For a moment he seemed lost in thought, as though he were grappling with something far deeper than he was willing to admit. But when he spoke again, his tone was resigned. "I made mistakes," he said softly, "but I can't change the past." His mother, who had stood quietly beside Kwame, stepped forward, her eyes filled with both anger and sadness. "No, you can't change the past," she said, "but you can decide what kind of father you want to be now." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time the millionaire seemed to consider them. He looked at Kwame, the boy who had grown up without him, the son he had never known, and something inside him shifted. He let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples as though trying to clear his head. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice quieter, less sure than it had been before. It's a lot to process." Kwame nodded, understanding but still feeling the sting of rejection. He had come here hoping for answers, for some kind of connection, but instead he had been met with a man who was as emotionally distant as he was physically removed from their lives. But even as they prepared to leave, there was a small glimmer of hope. The millionaire, for all his detachment, had acknowledged that Kwame was his son. He had admitted to his mistakes, and though it wasn't the warm embrace Kwame had hoped for, it was a start. As they walked out of the office, Kwame's mother placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. "It's not over," she said softly. "He just needs time." Kwame nodded, though his heart still ached. He had met his father, but the man he had found was a stranger, someone who lived in a world so far removed from his own that it seemed impossible to bridge the gap between them. Still, as they left the building and stepped back into the world outside, Kwame couldn't help but feel that something had changed. He had taken the first step, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he was no longer a boy searching for answers in the dark. His journey with his father was just beginning,